behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World, Season 3. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our session today, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future. Rory Medcalf in conversation with Tanvi Madan, supported by the Australian High Commission in India. Former diplomat, academic, and author Rory Medcalf's latest book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future, closely evaluates the Indo-Pacific region's role as a nucleus to the new interconnected world while detailing the history of the region and its current strategic conflicts. He discusses the relationship of countries such as Australia and India in the face of the exponential growth witnessed in China. Metcalf's diplomatic career included a posting in New Delhi, and he's currently the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. In conversation with foreign policy expert and author Tanvi Madan, he discusses the broad implications of China's rise and the contest for regional power. Professor Rory Medcalf is head of the National Security College at the Australian National University and has had 3 decades of experience across diplomacy, intelligence analysis, think tanks, academia, and journalism. He's been recognized as a thought leader internationally for his work on the Indo-Pacific strategic concept as articulated in his acclaimed 2020 book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War. Do remember that all our sessions that have been broadcast till now are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future, Rory Medcalf in conversation with Tanvi Madan, supported by the High Commission of Australia in India. Madan. Rory, Tanvi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation with Rory on his book. And it has 2 different covers. This is, I believe, the Australian version that features a very interesting map of the world as it looks like, that the world looks like from Australia's perspective. There's also, and I don't know how much you can see of this, but this is the kind of international edition called Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region, which is, of course, features China red and what looks like a Hokusai wave. And we might talk about, if we have time, the differences in the titles and the covers. It seems a particularly fitting time to be discussing the Indo-Pacific at this moment. Over the last few months, we've seen pushback from both the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers on the concept. The latter, Wang Yi, went from referring to it as sea foam that would soon, or ocean foam that would soon dissipate. And he went from that to saying it was a threat to the region as a concept, along with the quadrilateral that Australia, India, Japan, and the US have formed that would bring instability to the region. We've also seen some debate about how a Biden administration in the United States would approach the term and the concept Indo-Pacific after the current transition. And we've seen some of the transition members go from using the term Indo-Pacific in some readouts with phone calls to the president-elect and his Secretary of Defense designate reverting to the term Asia-Pacific, which has raised questions, which we will discuss during the course of this discussion. And finally, we've seen and heard Indian External Affairs Minister just last week, Dr. S. Jaishankar, in a message perhaps, and a signal perhaps, to Beijing, Moscow, and Washington, outlining why the Modi government embraced the concept and why it is using the term, saying, quote, "What begins in the Pacific no longer ends there, and the same holds true for the Indian Ocean, that the Indo-Pacific is not tomorrow's forecast, but yesterday's a reality." There's perhaps no one better to have this discussion with about the Indo-Pacific, its past, its present, its future, than Rory Medcalf, who's done much to popularize and help us understand the strategic concepts and its historical antecedents. His book indeed also helps bust some myths about the concept in the region, including that the Indo-Pacific is a new term, that it has been imposed on the region from the West, or the US in particular, that it is merely an anti-China concept, or that it is just about including India, that is an Asia-Pacific plus one. And finally, I think one of the most significant themes and myths that Rory busts in this book is that this is the story about and being defined just by the US and China or by their competition. So Rory, with that, I'd like to begin by asking you to outline some of the key themes and arguments of the book that you think readers should know about.
Thank you, Tanvi, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you, and thanks also to Sanjoy and all of the team. I'm joining you from Canberra, from Australia, and I look forward to an opportunity to get back to India when I can. The book was an opportunity for me to really, I guess, tell the story of the past 20 years in the region, and indeed to delve into the longer history too, but especially to unpack how we got to really the present moment in strategic contestation and, I hope, cooperation among countries as well. And it is, I think, as you said, partly an exercise in myth busting. So thank you for going there. I think, you know, in many ways, as my research uncovered, and this confirmed, if you like, some of the working assumptions that I'd made as a policy practitioner. It's a multipolar region. That's one of the major arguments of the book. It's a region where the maritime continues to predominate, and we can talk about that in a little while because it has big implications for power relations and outcomes. It's a region where there is a long history of both connectivity and contestation across the two oceans. And so in a sense, the book makes the case that we are indeed reverting to almost a more natural fit for our regional order, an Indo-Pacific definition, and that in turn will provide one of the elements we need for really managing or limiting Chinese power. It's a region that is too vast for any one country to dominate, and to the extent that there is a kind of almost imperial character to what China is trying to do in the region, there's going to be lessons learned, I think, from empires past of overstretch in this very large space. Look, and perhaps getting into the conversation a bit later, the book is also, as well as, I guess, a fresh telling of the history of the region to explain why the Indo-Pacific is useful for policymakers today in many of our countries. The book also tries to draw a kind of a framework around the strategic competition that's unfolding, emphasising that this is not just a military competition, that a lot of the elements we're seeing now in this COVID or post-COVID era, the use of economics, propaganda and so forth, these are going to be all elements of the competition where in many ways we're trying to come to terms with Chinese power and influence and maintain our nation's sovereignty and self-respect.
Just Rory, on that, since you kind of mentioned the maritime part, and I think in the book you lay out very well why it is important for policymakers to have this mental map. And you talk about how mental maps can affect statecraft. So talk to us a little bit about why you think this mental map, as opposed to the one that others have been used to, Asia or Asia-Pacific, matters in particular in the context of what you lay out as this kind of maritime and multipolar setting that defines the region.
Sure. Well, I think, of course, the book contains many maps, and it's a bit of a pity that we're not sharing them in the conversation today. But I think as your readers, I hope, viewers, I hope, get into the book, you'll see all sorts of interesting depictions of the region, tantalising glimpses of the way that decision makers, policy makers, militaries, commercial entities and so forth have defined this region throughout history. And it is important because going back really as far as ancient times or the medieval era or the colonial era and beyond, the region has consistently been imagined as encompassing the two ocean system. I think, you know, even the idea of Asia in many ways, which in some ways, I guess, To the extent to which Asia is a concept, almost a European concept that was imposed on the region, it was defined as this much larger system, not merely a narrow Sino-centric East Asian region. And the maritime was always important. We've heard about the Silk Road from the Chinese perspective in history. We know about the great impact of Indian civilizations and cultures in Southeast Asia and beyond. But so many of the pathways for this were maritime. Going to the present day, I think what's really important to understand, even in this era when international connectivity, when globalization has been challenged by nationalism, by protectionism, by the impacts of the pandemic, maritime trade is still extraordinarily important in the region. And of course, globally, it's far cheaper, far more affordable and economical than overland trade. Maritime power, and we've seen China's decisive attempt to turn to the sea in the past 10 to 15 years as a naval power. Maritime power provides a flexibility and an impact that really land power cannot. And so when you bring these factors together and you look at the interactions among countries in our region, the maritime continues to predominate and gives opportunities for countries like Australia, for India, for Japan, hint, hint, the quadrilateral countries, but others as well. It gives opportunities to really cast a much wider net when it goes to building the partnerships that we need to set limits to any would-be hegemon such as China.
So just to draw you out on this a little bit, I mean, you've heard one of the critiques in India, that of the Indo-Pacific, which is somewhat different critique than you hear in others. And it's not the one about, every country having a different definition of it, but that the very fact that it is a maritime concept doesn't quite address India's view of the region, which is that there is a major continental dimension of India's challenge, India's opportunity, its neighborhood. How do you see these two linking up? What is the case you would make to Indians who say the Indo-Pacific is not for us because our major challenges are continental, whether that is the boundary crisis with China, whether that is and the other adversary that India has, or rival, if you want to put it that way, in Pakistan?
No, look, I mean, it's a very reasonable question, and I certainly, I'm not doctrinaire about this. I'm not even doctrinaire about the term Indo-Pacific, believe it or not. I just think it's useful. But the two answers to that question are, firstly, that particularly for India, which in some ways is an island, in some ways not. It's got some very significant, if you like, maritime frontiers. The ocean really is the opportunity for India. It's one of a number of opportunities for India to expand its horizons, to engage with the world, and to get beyond some of the very difficult sense of stalemate, some of the the very difficult, sense of the obstacles that India has on its land frontiers. They're going to remain there, but the opportunity in many ways for building wider connections in the world, building partnerships, building power projection, and incidentally, the opportunity to be able to frustrate China's maritime ambitions in the Indian Ocean. All of this is literally at sea. So I still think there is a strong case for India as a sea power, but of course India needs to maintain its interests, protect its interests on land as well, almost as a starting point. The second point I'd note is that, just as in the Chinese vision, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the book is partly about a corrective to the Belt and Road, to argue that there are other ways of understanding the region that are at least as valid, I think arguably much more valid. The land matters too, the continental matters too, and both of these initiatives, in the Chinese case, overland connectivity and influence through the so-called Silk Road economic belt, maritime power projection, connections and influence through the maritime Silk Road, all of this matters at that point of boundary, where the land connects to the sea. Look at the emphasis on seaports in the Belt and Road Initiative. Look at the emphasis on developing seaports in many of the other infrastructure initiatives that, for example, India, Japan, Australia, Europe, the United States, other partners are trying to build as well. And so both matter, but in fact, one can't matter without the other. And my argument is that in the end, the sea provides that opportunity for mobility in every sense of the word for an emerging power. We'd be crazy to leave it to China.
So speaking of India, but also kind of bringing in Australia, one of the themes in your book is something you've mentioned, which is multipolarity and the kind of role of powers that aren't named US and China. Your foreign minister, Marise Payne, recently, and she, for those who don't know, along with Senator Penny Wong, who's the shadow foreign minister, way back whenever your book launch was held, pre-pandemic days, which seems like a century, just March, it seems like a century ago. They both spoke at your book launch, which is a testament to the impact that your ideas have had and that this book has had. But just recently, she said in a speech that the US and China are not the whole story. Regional powers have genuine agency and influence. None of us is a bystander. I want to spend some time talking about that, both because of what the countries that she's talking about obviously involve Australia, but also countries like India, and we'll have, I suspect, a large audience that will be interested in that. We've heard a lot about these kind of powers, these regional powers. Your book echoes this similar theme, outlines it. And we've heard a lot these days about like-minded partners. So tell me, what does like-minded mean in the Indo-Pacific as you lay out in your book? What are these countries like-minded about? Some would argue that everybody has a different Indo-Pacific concept or strategy. I would argue that's a strength, but some see it as a problem. So what are these key countries that you see in the region? What are the overlaps? What are the significant differences? And then perhaps after that, I'd like to kind of draw you out on what you think these other countries in the region can do together and with others in the region.
Thanks, Tanvi. And I think that is one of the big arguments of the book, that it's really in many ways about the middle players. I'm reluctant to use the word middle powers because obviously if you look at every country from Australia to Vietnam to India to Japan to Singapore to Indonesia, etc., we all have different levels of wealth, power and influence. But we're the middle players. And the book in many ways is meant to be confident, not optimistic, but confident about the ability of middle players to do a lot more together. Indeed, one of the critiques of the book by an Australian colleague has been that it doesn't, it's more of an affirmative book about middle powers rather than necessarily just a critical book about China, which I think is quite reasonable despite the catchy title. So what can the middle powers do together? Again, we've got to be realistic about this. We're coming up from a long, long way down. If you think back 10, 15, 20 years, how little connection there was among so many of our countries, how little in terms of trade and investment, how pitifully little in terms of security cooperation, trusted dialogue, intelligence sharing, technology sharing, and indeed the level of societal interaction as well, bearing in mind that that people of Indian origin are really the fastest growing and one of the largest migrant communities in Australia. It's been an extraordinary journey, but we're still at a very early stage. And so the book makes the argument that let's play a long game here, and that's a kind of a line that I think the Australian Prime Minister has started using in relation to our relations with China, although I would normally say to this audience that it's a bit like Test cricket, although at the moment Test cricket, sometimes isn't as long a game as we'd all like it to be. I'm sure
but we're trying to talk about convergences today, Rory.
I'm sure we'll see that come back. I went and saw India play at one of the one-day matches recently, and we were humbled on that occasion. So it comes around. But look, seriously, it is a long game of middle power contestation and great power contestation in the region. We're talking 20, 30 years. We're talking really, I think, until we find some kind of settling point where clearer limits are set to China's power and its use of its power. And so the middle powers are forming all sorts of interesting new arrangements, the trilaterals, their role in the quadrilateral dialogue with the United States. The bilaterals among the middle players, look at Australia, India, India, Japan, Australia, Japan, and so forth, again, are becoming really substantial. And there's some other very interesting triangles forming, even Australia, India, France, Australia, India, Indonesia. All of this begins at the level of trusted dialogue. And you can easily argue, well, so what? You know, nations talk to nations, that's diplomacy. It's not true balancing. The real test is going to be what we do in addition to dialogue, and there are some green shoots already, particularly in areas like military exercises, intelligence sharing, you know, the prospect of technology transfer, the prospect of coordinating, in fact, the actuality of coordinating our capacity building, our development assistance to third countries, so that we can really set a kind of a web that limits Chinese power. But I think I think my friends in the policy communities in our countries don't have any illusions that this is going to automatically amount to some kind of formal alliance or treaty system, nor should it, because at the same time, we're going to have to do quite a lot on our own. When it comes to the like-mindedness, and I'll sort of pause on that point, the like-mindedness, which is a kind of at one level, yes, a glib, useful term that diplomats and ministers use, it does not mean that we have an identical alignment of our values or an identical alignment of our interests or an identical alignment even of our mental maps of the region, which really overlap rather than are perfectly congruent. But what it does mean is a shared commitment, certainly to our own sovereignty, and I think to supporting a regional order that respects the sovereignty and interests of all. And that's where I think, disappointingly, very disappointingly, China has not been the power that perhaps 15, 20 years ago it was promising to be, a country that does respect the rights and interests of others and that holds back from, for example, interfering inside their societies, interfering with their political and diplomatic decisions.
Well, and if any country could give us a lot of information about that and has been kind of almost the canary in the coal mine in many ways, or at least the most prominent one, it's been Australia. If you'd asked most people in Delhi a few years ago, there was this view in India and elsewhere of Canberra as being soft on China. Now, you can argue that point, and many have, but it was one held, including at the highest levels in India. And there was a sense that it held India back, particularly on defense and security cooperation with Australia. That view has, I think, definitely changed within the Indian government. But there are still questions, I think, in many quarters, not just in India, but elsewhere, about Australia, where Australia-China relations stand, what the view of China is, what the change has been over the last few years. So can you lay out for us, what's the state of the debate on China policy within Australia? Talked about recent developments as well. And to put it a little provocatively, has over the last year China been a bigger challenge for Canberra than even COVID?
Well, I guess, and you could start by saying that China and COVID are perhaps connected challenges. Let's see what the international investigations actually uncover there. But in fact, one of the reasons that China's been so angry at Australia this year is that Australia was one of the first countries to really openly call for an investigation, a proper independent investigation into the origins of this terrible pandemic. The Australia-China story it's part of the story of the Indo-Pacific. It is a kind of an early warning system, if you like, I think, for what a lot of other countries, especially democracies in the region and globally, are going to expect or have to expect from a China that really does not seem to respect their sovereignty. And indeed, it's almost another book in itself, and perhaps that's going to be the next thing I write when I get through my current phase of extreme writer's block. I'm sure you know. Well, maybe you don't know the feeling, Tanvi, because I suspect that you're following up your fantastic book on the US, India and China as well. But look, the Australia-China story is really complex. It needs to be understood. It is a warning, if you like, to the world. it's not as simple as some observers would suggest. It's not as if Australia went from, a complete love affair with China 10 years ago or 20 years ago to being essentially now almost, China's least favoured nation in the world. We are going through a phase of pretty intense, pretty comprehensive difference, almost confrontation with China, without, though I should add, the dimension of military confrontation that I know India has endured this year. But the story is really one of Australia having no illusions anymore. And I think you could argue that 10 or 15 years ago, there were those in our system, in our policy community, certainly in our business community, who focused on China as opportunity, economic opportunity in particular. And some of that was, if you like, motivated by obviously the most, basic of commercial motives, if you like. There was a lot of money to be made. Some of that also was really about engagement with our region. Australia is a country that's always, certainly in recent history, felt a particular need to engage with our region because of our very interesting, complex history, our cultural history, a country with, if you like, in modern times, a European settlement origin, essentially at the edge of the Indo-Pacific, of an Asia-centric maritime region. So we tried extra hard, if you like, to engage with the region, and that's one of the reasons, I think, for the success of the Australia-India relationship recently. But there was a mistake in much of the analysis and much of the policy optimism, and that mistake was to conflate China with the region. Whereas, of course, in many ways, so much of the rest of the Indo-Pacific region has its own complex history of coexistence, but also mistrust with China. So maybe Australia's come late to that party, but Australia has now gone an enormous way in correcting and in really hardening our national sovereignty against the much more assertive, almost aggressive China that we're dealing with now. There's been a kind of a series of wake-up calls, I'd say, over the past 5 or 6 years. It goes back a little longer than the media, if you like, narrative would suggest. But certainly by 2016, our political class was starting to wake up to China as risk. Our national security community had always been, I think, very sensitive to this. And we began to recognise that a lot of the economic engagement that looked purely like opportunity was also, if you like, a process that was giving China leverage, coercive leverage over Australia in future. We had an over-dependence in that regard. But the real clincher was the issue of foreign interference, of political interference and influence operations inside Australian society, inside Australian business, and inside our political community by the Chinese Communist Party and or its proxies in the so-called United Front. A lot of excellent work by Australian journalists and the Australian intelligence community helped to unearth enough of this, perhaps the tip of a much larger iceberg, that the Australian political elite was motivated to action, some very firm laws on foreign interference, on foreign investment, and so forth, which of course China reacted negatively to. And those factors, combined with Australia's own brand of self-interested, assertive diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, with Indo-Pacific partners, and our advocacy of this multilateral and minilateral cooperation in the region. And then finally, our outspokenness on COVID, all of these factors seem to have combined to, if you like, prompt China now to see Australia as perhaps an even greater risk to its interests than we are. And we're now in this, I think, prolonged phase of difficulty, almost crisis. Where will it end? Let's see.
Well, one of the things that you've talked about, and I think has been much talked about, not just in the region or amongst these kind of like-minded countries, are exactly the kind of minilaterals that you've laid out already, the trilaterals, the quadrilateral, and I want to come back to those. But I want to talk about two countries that we have discussed, and the book discusses, along with others like Indonesia, like Japan. But I want to talk about Australia and India for a bit, because if you think about a number of the minilaterals, including a new one that we've been hearing was supposed to be launched, I think, by the end of the year, the kind of a supply chain resiliency initiative that Australia, Japan, and India announced. Australia and India are part of kind of many of these minilaterals, and there are others that people have proposed: a G7+3, a Democracy 10, a T12. Throw your favorite one in. And to me, this is kind of reflective and just one sign of the change, how much has changed in the Australia-India relationship. If I had to identify the country with which Delhi's interactions, perhaps to me, have been most strikingly changed, not just kind of sped up, but changed in their character in some ways, I'd say it was India's relationship with Australia over the last few years. And I'm not just saying this because the Australian High Commission in Delhi is a co-host of this event. Even the Indian Foreign Minister noted this recently. You've seen the kind of increase in exercises, the Australian inclusion in the Malabar exercise. As you said, Australia seems to be India's favorite trilateral partner, with Japan, France, Indonesia, the revival of the Quad. And a very substantive summit between the prime ministers earlier this year, what I've taken to calling the Momo Summit, and I suspect we'll see a few more of those. Tell us why you think, these countries, you can say, okay, on the one hand, don't have any fundamental conflicts of interest other than in the cricketing arena, of course. But then again, that has been the case for a while. And people used to say the relationship was about, cricket, curry, and Commonwealth, if I remember correctly. But that's changed. From your perspective, what has driven this broader shift? And then what do you think, from your perspective, and I know you outlined some of them in the section on India in your book, what are some of the obstacles you see, both to India's role as a major or middle player in the region, as well as to the Australia-India relationship really getting to its full potential?
Look, there's a lot there. In many ways, it's the story of my life in the past 20 years, because I've seen directly the profound change in relations between Australia and India, and that's been enormously pleasing to see. I was posted in Delhi back in the at the turn of the century, you might say. There were obviously, there was the shadow of certain events in the 1990s, including nuclear tests and Australia's response to that. That is now really ancient history in the bilateral relationship. Look, I think what happened is that we were estranged democracies without a sufficient sense of the breadth of our region. So part of the shift was, literally recognising that we really were belonging to the same region, and we had an interest in supporting one another, in enabling one another to be more active players in this region. There were two security issues that were imperatives of that. One was, of course, the struggle against terrorism. In fact, the post 9/11 era and the constant threat that India's had with terrorism over the years. That was one factor that I think helped to bring us together. But the other was the power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, and that is a polite way of talking about China in many ways, because Australia and India were spreading their strategic and diplomatic horizons, recognising that we really, in some ways, needed to rely on this wider web of partners, and recognising greater capability in one another. I think one of the big myths of years past was that both India and Australia tended to underestimate the capability of the other and the capacity of the other, what we could do for ourselves and what we could do for each other. And that's really, there's been a profound change in that recognition, partly because, of course, the nature of power is now differently understood by both countries to be encompassing much more than simply one-dimensional military dimensions of power, or even, the raw size of one's economy, in terms of technology, in terms of talent, in terms of the complementary nature of our economies. There's enormous activity there, and I think the people factor really is important. The fact that there is such a dynamic and growing Indian community in Australia is now really part of that wider glue. So I think we've really, put aside the ghosts of the 20th century. There's a recognition, I think, now in India of what a multicultural society Australia is. And so, 1950s attitudes that you would have encountered in Australia once upon a time, about race, or the perception from India that Australia was simply an appendage of either the British Empire or indeed of the American order. That's all gone. And there's, I think, great mutual respect for what we can do to help one another. The warmth between the prime ministers is part of that. And so we're at the cusp of a really exciting time. But again, just as with the mini laterals I talked about, policymakers have to be careful that we don't have inflated expectations, because it can be slow going. And I think, to answer the second part of your question, in my book, I do look at some length at the challenges India faces. Many of them are well known. I think it's good to see, in some ways, India is beginning to get over some of its own, if you like, self-imposed bureaucratic hurdles of the past. We want to see the Indian private sector play a much bigger role in India's relations with the world. And I think we also have to be careful that the way in which our two countries, our two societies, are delivering democracy and living democracy, including, with the problems that we both have on that journey. We have to recognise and respect that, and not have the illusion that we're precisely the same. But I think so far, there's a fair bit of realism beneath all of the positive talk, and that's a good thing.
One of the things that your book does is also lay out on that, in terms of both the opportunities and challenges, I think, why India is different from China, even though they're similar in many ways, and why in some ways so many countries are invested in India's success. A lot of it is about India being kind of a democratic power, but also kind of a diverse power that, if it succeeds, if it develops, can challenge some of the myths that China puts out there about democracy's inability to deliver. I do want to come to China and the US, which, though your book says, the story is about more than them, they are very much part of the story. You talk about maritime Asia, and you remind people maritime Asia was not a China-centric region, as some would, some of the commentary these days would make it seem like. But that China, in some ways today, that has resisted this concept of the Indo-Pacific, has partly, its behavior is what has made this concept real. And you've laid out some of the challenges that we've seen over this last year, but over the last few years from Beijing in particular. How do you see countries, Australia, India, the US, others, the European countries? Almost every one of these countries is balancing competition with China, while still needing and wanting to cooperate with China for a number of different reasons: global issues, economic ties. The book suggests that where we might come out on this is coexistence. What does that look like? How do countries balance these two elements? Because every one of us is grappling with it.
Yeah, look, I think it's very hard to fit all of this into one book, and in many ways, in the final chapter of the book, which I think you're referring to in particular, where I try to develop a sort of a typology for understanding the dynamics in the region, where we are and where we want to be, everything from cooperation at one very hopeful end of the spectrum right through to armed conflict at the other. And I focus on the middle ground, on the coexistence that I think is it's not an ideal ultimate end goal. It's a pretty dreary kind of life objective. We all want to do better than coexistence, but coexistence is a realistic goal for the time being. Indeed, competitive coexistence, which is a term that I used, it's a term that a number of other scholars and policy figures have used. I think Kurt Campbell used it recently in foreign affairs as well. That's I have a feeling it's a term that that Jake Sullivan, the new incoming NSA, will use. It's enough for now. It just means that, in a sense, we're managing the power competition in the region. There's sufficient mutual respect not only in any kind of moral sense, but also in the sense of an appreciation of one another's ability, of each country's ability to do the other harm, that we can get by and we can begin building confidence and building the foundations for cooperation later on. It doesn't involve fundamental trust, because at the moment I think that's an unrealistic goal with China. So how do we stay there? How do we get there and stay there? I take a view in the book that although in some ways the Trump administration may have actually been useful in giving China pause, in giving China a sense that it could not be the master of infinite recklessness anymore in the international system, that China too was going to have to endure costs. And of course, the Trump administration was the US administration that fairly wholeheartedly endorsed the term Indo-Pacific, although if we get to the US a bit later on, we must remember that Indo-Pacific was a term first used, in fact, under the Obama administration. But the Trump administration, I think, has outlived its usefulness in the Indo-Pacific power game, precisely because it really was not able to bring allies and partners comprehensively along. Now, we can talk later about whether a Biden administration can do that. There's a question mark. But I think Trump was showing so little respect for allies and partners that it was going to be really hard to marshal and sustain the kind of coalition we need to balance Chinese power and to create the conditions for coexistence without relying on confrontation, because of course that's the danger zone. Look, I'm not sure Australia's in the best place to almost have this conversation at the moment, because we're dealing with another C word, which is coercion, which is very much part of that whole confrontation package. But I do think that if we look at our options over time and we look at our national options in the context of the wider regional and global system, that we can see some of the elements for that settling point, that coexistence. Firstly, it's really not being not only not being the instigator of confrontation, but being willing to work with others to call out bad behaviour when we see it. To set some sort of expectations ahead of time, so that when in future China is coercive on the contested border with India, or China is coercive against Australia economically, or against Japan or Vietnam or European partners or others, that increasingly you have a coalition of interests that can identify those pressure points and really identify measures that they will take preventively or in response. Very easy to talk about this in theory, very hard to translate that into some kind of, if you like, almost a system of international sanctions or responses. But we're going to see hints of that increasingly in areas like technology, human rights, indeed the response to China's actions in Hong Kong, and again, the terrible actions against its Uyghur population. But a lot of this will depend on the political will in countries like India and Australia, and it's the political will that China is trying to erode or break through its coercive tactics. So in fact, collective action on information and countering propaganda is actually one of the vital areas where we can build common cause, and it's also an area where I think the so-called like-minded countries can start working together with fairly minimal cost.
Well, one of the reasons I'd recommend this book is that you lay out kind of almost an agenda for collective action, some principles, and also emphasize the need to show solidarity, which is about more than drinking Australian wine and eating Australian lobster, though I would recommend that as well.
That helps present time.
That does help. But also the concept of resilience that we've been hearing a lot about, particularly given COVID and the pandemic. I'm told our time is up, but I do want to draw you out on something you mentioned and end with that, which is you talked about collective action, you talked about working together. This is partly why almost every like-minded country is watching what the others are doing. We've seen the EU, for example, move to signing an investment agreement with China, and seen US National Security Advisor designate Jake Sullivan expressed some discomfort with that, or alluded to it, and said the countries should work together. But I want to end with asking you how Canberra is viewing a potential Biden's approach, a Biden administration's approach to the region, to China, what you'd like to see, and what you worry about.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously it's too early to tell at this stage, but the ball is really in our court as a US ally. I think the ball is in India's court as a, a vital strategic partner of the United States and of ours as well. It's really an opportunity for the allies and partners now to actually mount kind of our own concerted pressure and influence and persuasion campaign on our friends in Washington, DC and the new administration. Because no question, a Biden administration has an enormous job to do at home, and you would see in the the Washington environment and I guess ground level in the United States that of course nation building begins at home and resilience begins at home, and that is priority number one. But I think we have to be constantly reminding our American friends that the Indo-Pacific is it's now the central region of strategic contest globally, that if the United States is serious about competing with China, then it has to be active, present and working with partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific. It may not matter so much in my view whether our American friends are religiously consistent in the terminology that they use, but following through now on some elements of what I would call Indo-Pacific strategy, and that is elements of what was promised under the Trump administration, even elements of what was foreshadowed in the Obama era pivot, because these things are not, mutually exclusive. Following through with obviously maintaining force presence, with maintaining the military dimension, but with building much greater cooperative activity with allies and partners in the geoeconomic, the technology, the pandemic response, all of these areas where China, in a sense, is trying to win without fighting in the region. If a Biden administration can even really fulfill 50% of its potential in working with us on those issues, it's going to create a much more difficult context for China to dominate the region. It's going to rebuild, I think, sufficient goodwill in those parts of the Indo-Pacific where American credibility and reputation was dented by Trump. And I'm not necessarily sure I include India on that list because I think India had its own perceptions of the Trump administration. But I think it will be part of a positive global story. And I wouldn't leave Europe out of that conversation because in a way, as I argue in the book, it's a many-layered contest, and the global dimensions of the contest that include particularly technology and propaganda, it's just as important to bring a coalition together of like-mindeds globally as it is in the Indo-Pacific. So the jury is out on what a Biden administration will do. I think there's enough positive signs, and particularly in the messaging that's come out of the writings of Jake Sullivan. And I think, if you like, the muscle memory of a lot of the American policy and security establishment, that I think we've got something to work with here. But this is time for the middle powers to step up and help show the way.
And with that, Rory, we can also hope that none of what you call black elephants show up, looming events that take us by surprise, known unknowns. And for the readers, there's a section that describes some of those potential black elephants in the book. With that, Rory, thank you so much. And thank you to JLF as well for hosting this event. Over to you, Sanjoy.
Thanks so much, Tanvi Madan. Thank you, Rory Medcalf. Hopefully no black elephants pop up. And as Rory said, there's nothing to show that Joe Biden may not quite stick to the script that had been laid out in earlier years, in earlier terms. And that's something that we have to look to. Yes, hatred is still an issue. Disinformation continues to plague all our lives. And these are issues that we'll all have to collectively struggle with. But I do remember when Peter Verghese was the High Commissioner some years ago, Australia-India relationships were not quite what they are today. There was a lot of effort made by the Australian government to really, on every possible level to try and get this relationship back on even keel. And I think now it is on even keel. There's a lot of deep respect and understanding despite what's happened in cricket. In an earlier time, should this have happened, we would have had rioting on the streets, but we don't. And that really goes to show, how much this relationship has improved. So thank you, Rory. Thank you to everybody on both sides of the ocean divide. And of course, thank you to the Australian High Commission for supporting this particular session that we've had today. Please do log back on for our next session, Dharma, Decoding the Epic for a Meaningful Life, with Amish and Bhavna Roy in conversation with Vayu Naidu. This is celebrated writer Amish's latest book, Dharma, Decoding the Epics for a Meaningful Life, co-authored with Bhavna Roy, illuminative narrative on the essential concepts of Indian philosophy. And this is at 8:30 p.m. IST, 3 p.m. GMT, and 10 a.m. EST. Till then, stay safe. Thank you.